Okay, so now we're going to take a look at functions that take in parameters. So we've seen functions with no parameters and no return type. Now we're going to include some parameters. So we're going to first take a look at a continuation from our last print function. So before, again, no parameters, this one's going to take in a parameter and print that out. Okay, and then we're also going to do something a little more advanced, which is going to be introducing some functions that take in integer parameters. And so one's going to take in 1 and one's going to take in 2. Hey guys, if anyone's experiencing a bunch of crashes with the Xcode beta, the Xcode beta 10 version, I'm not really sure what's going on or why it's crashing so much, but I've had it crash a few times. Unfortunately, that's just a side effect of it being the beta version. They haven't quite ironed out the bugs, so just be patient and stick with it. But anyway, let's get back to the tutorial. So we have now seen a simple function that basically takes no parameters and had no return type. All it did was perform a call to the print function itself and print out Mammoth Interactive. Now, it wasn't a particularly exciting function because it's just doing the same thing every time, which is just going to be printing out Mammoth Interactive, and we could have just as easily done that with this. Okay, but that's not the point of this function. The point is to show you that we can kind of call a function to perform the same task time and time again without having to manually go in and type out this task. Okay, so these functions are supposed to make things easier and faster for us. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of variation on that, and we're going to look at functions that can take in parameters. So the first one's going to take in a string and it's going to print something out. So we're going to call this print something as well. But instead of leaving these brackets blank, I'm going to pass it in something and I'm going to call it something. And I am going to say this is type string. Okay? And we're going to set this up. It's not going to have a return type. It's just going to take in some parameters and print something. So all we're going to do is we're going to call the print function and we're going to put something inside. So before we run this and pass it in some parameters, let's go over what's happening. So we have the name, aptly named, again an action word, and it's indicative of what it's doing. We have obviously put the call to function there. We're taking in a parameter, only one, which is going to be a string. And so anything we pass in will be labeled as something for the purposes of this function. So if we pass it in something like hello, then something takes on the value of hello. If we pass it in mammoth, then something takes on the value of mammoth. Okay? And then all it's going to do is it's going to call the print function and it's going to call whatever we put in here. Okay, so if we were to call print something on hello, then we'll wait for it to run. And what seems to be the issue here? Ah, that's why. Something hello, there we go. We get hello being printed out there, okay? And same with if we change this to Mammoth Interactive, then we'd also get Mammoth Interactive. So when we're calling the function with some parameters, we have to assign which parameter is going to take on the value that we plugged in. And this will become more clear when we have multiple parameters in one function call. But basically we're saying for the sakes of for the sakes of this function, we're just assigning something within this function to take on this value here. Okay, so Mammoth Interactive in this case. Now this again it's a little bit of a step forwards because we're now passing in a string and telling the function to print it, but again it's still not really any faster than calling the print function itself. Okay, so I'm just going to comment this out so that it doesn't call the print function every time, and we're going to work with numbers instead. Okay, so we're going to have this function and it's going to be called double number. Okay, and as a side note guys, if you are kind of getting confused in your code as to exactly what everything is doing, you can add in these comments here. So for example, if this function double number, I don't know what it does, I can just add in this comment, so doubles the input number. Okay, and that just tells me what it does so that I know. So if if I'm kind of confused as to the syntax or I can't quite read the code properly, then this way I know exactly what the function is doing when I call it. Okay, and this is especially important if either A, the function has a confusing name, or B, we can't exactly read the code very well. Okay, so again, if you're getting confused, add in these comments. Otherwise, try to leave them out because it can make the code a little messy. Okay, so this one is, instead of taking a string, this one's going to take in a number, and I'm going to call this number, and it's going to take in just an int. Okay, we could assign a float or double if we really wanted, but I'm just going to stick with integers because I prefer to use ints when I can. So again, we have the function name, double number. It's just going to double a number, so that's a good name for it. And it's going to take in an integer, which we'll assign to contain the name number. And so what this is going to do is we're just going to do number times 2. Okay? And then we could call the print function if we want. So let's just call print number. Okay, so we have our function set up. Before we run this, however, let's just do a quick recap of what this function's doing. So it's taking in an integer, just 1, and it's multiplying it by 2 here. So it's taking this integer, assigning it to the variable number, or the constant number. It's timesing the constant by 2, and it's just printing it out. So if we pass in a parameter, this is no longer a variable, this becomes a constant, okay? So we can't change a constant's value, but in this case, in fact, I should put that right in the print statement itself. I'm just going to say print number times 2. So this is going to take in the input number, times it by 2, and just print it out. Okay, so let's go ahead and call the function and see it work. So we'll pass in number, and let's give it 5 to start off with. Let's just wait for this to run and see what pops up. Yay, we get 10 there. Okay, that's excellent. So now we know the function's working as it should. So what we did when we called the function down here is we passed it in 5 and assigned number to contain the value 5. The function then recognizes that number contains a value 5, and it says print whatever's in this brackets, and whatever's in this brackets is it takes 5 times 2, so 10, and it prints out 10. So same with if we called 20 on this, should print out 40, and if we call 100, if I can select it there, 100, then we get 200 being printed out. Okay, cool stuff. So now we've seen strings and ints. Now let's take a look at double parameters. Okay, so we're going to do something a little different than, well, I mean, we'll still print out the value, but instead of multiplying it by 2, let's do something different. Let's multiply these two numbers together. So we'll call this function, this will be multiply numbers, and it's going to take in number 1, that's going to be int, and it's going to take in number 2, and that's also going to be of type int. Okay, so again, no return type. I'm just going to comment that out again so it doesn't keep printing every time. Okay, so now we're taking two parameters separated by the comma here. We could take in parameters of multiple types. We could take in something like a boolean and a number, or like a string and an int or something. But for our sakes and purposes, because we're multiplying the two together, I think it's more appropriate to have two numbers. So I just labeled these number 1 and number 2. I think that they're pretty boring names, but you know, we're keeping things simple and straightforward here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do print, and we're going to say number 1 times number 2. Alright, so before we run this, let's just go through what we would expect to have happen. Well, when we call our multiply numbers function, we now have to pass in two integers rather than just one seen up here, and it's just going to take the two, multiply them together, and print them out. Okay, so let's go ahead and call this, and as you can see, it appears on our list of possible function calls. It's going to be multiply numbers. I'm going to close that up, and this is going to be number 1. Let's just give it 5, and number 2, let's give it an 8. So this should print out 40. There we go. And indeed it does. Okay, so we know it's working exactly as it should. Okay, so it's taken in one parameter, which is going to be assigned to the constant number 1, and the second parameter is going to be assigned to constant number 2, and it's just going to multiply them and print them, and that's exactly what it does. And just to prove this, let's put in 100, and there we get 800. Okay, so now we know everything's working as it should. Alright, so this is how to input parameters into your function to use them. I'm just going to do a brief recap of what we've learned so far. So the first thing we did is we created this print something function, which is kind of a continuation of our last print function. So all it's doing is we're going to pass it in some kind of a string, and it's going to print that out. So rather than in the previous version where we saw Mammoth Interactive printed every time, it's going to print in whatever we put in. So in this case we put in Mammoth Interactive, so it printed that out, but we could put in hello, we could put in whatever kind of string we want. Then we looked at a function that takes in an integer as a parameter. So again, just the 1, and it just doubled that integer and printed it out. And then we had another function that took in 2 integers, multiplied them together, and then printed it out. Okay, so these functions have all been kind of print functions. They perform this task and printed them out. Now we're going to take a look at, well, in this next part, we're going to take a look at functions that have return types. So this is going to be, notice how none of these have the return type arrow. Well, that's because none of them are returning anything. Now we're going to take a look at functions that do return stuff. Okay, so in this part we looked at functions with parameters. So our first function we looked at was another print function, and this time it printed whatever the input into the function call was. So we called the function, we gave it an input string, and it printed that out. So rather than the one that we saw last tutorial, which kind of just printed out the same thing every time. We also took a look at 2 integer functions, so one that doubled the input, just took in 1 integer and doubled it and printed it out. And then we also looked at another one that took in 2 inputs this time, so it had 2 integer parameters, and it just multiplied those 2 together and printed them out. Now we'll take a look at functions that have return types.